Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to read and to respond to these three interesting studies. It is a great honor, and I'm very happy to be here. As I understand, my role as a discussant is actually to place these papers within a broader research context and thus help understand their specific contribution, while on the other hand also to provide insights and as well as some new directions for the writer. So this is indeed a big challenge, and I'll try to do my best to meet this challenge. Now, the common ground for all three papers, sharing one panel and a discussant coming from a different area of study, derives from the attempt of scholars in recent decades not to leave out the history of non-Muslims of the empire as a secluded piece of history, but rather to treat them as integral part of the Ottoman societies and state. Of course, these studies seek to contribute to the understanding of non-Muslim societies, yet scholars realize that it should be examined within the Ottoman context. So in this respect, these three papers are a welcome contribution not only to the history of the Jewish and non-Muslim communities in the empire, but also to the Ottoman history as well, in general. Now, the differences between the papers are large and varied, and therefore they deal with different periods, different phenomena, and various methodologies and sources. So therefore, I would like to refer to each one of them separately at that stage. I'll begin with Professor Mina Rozen's papers on the urban history of the Jews of Istanbul as reflected in the documents of rabbinic court registers in the first half of the 19th century. Now, the title of the paper reveals its twofold goals. To contribute to our understanding of the pattern of Jewish settlements and geography in Istanbul in the 19th century, and of course the historical change in these patterns, and on the other hand, to reveal the importance of the rabbinic court registers in the process of constructing urban history of Jews. Now, this dual purpose is not only reflected in the title, but also reflected in the division of the paper into four different sections that actually serve these two purposes. The second and the fourth section, dealing with housing patterns and population distribution over Istanbul's neighborhoods, are the parts that actually contribute to the construction of Istanbul's Jewish urban history, while the first and the third sections actually describes the rabbinic court records itself and the approaches to evaluate the information that can be derived from these sections. So these parts are actually intended for the second purpose, namely exposing this source to the various readers and emphasizing its uniqueness. And indeed, this second and fourth section, in these sections, Rozen shows convincingly that it is possible to find important information in the court's registration. The article is impressively embedded in many numerical data extracted by Rozen from the legal records. Rozen provides us with the various examples that emerge from the registers and show how rabbinic court records leave us with great clues about the presence of Jews in the 19th century in Istanbul's various neighborhoods. Rozen shows clearly how entries in these registers made about Jewish property and action carried out with this property in the court can indicate patterns of ownership, forms of residence, and the level of wealth compared to other places of settlements in Istanbul. What also can help us compare between different neighborhoods of the city. Rozen also rightly claims that despite the richness of the documents and the ability to extract the data mentioned above, they lack the information about the number of the Jewish population in Istanbul, as well as in the above-mentioned quarters. However, I would like to suggest in this context that the double structure, the historical and the methodological historiographical aspect, has led to the neglect or omission of important aspects that could have contributed to understanding the issue in questions. It seems that the desire to serve both goals equally without deciding what is the previous one caused for some lack of some important references in the article. Such is the fact the assessment of the source in the article is missing a lot of information. There is no explanation about the institution, the rabbinic court, that produced these documents, not a reference to the procedure of the registration, also the people and the opportunities that people actually use this court. It should be noted that Rosen uses the legal source to understand and write about urban history of Jews in part of the general trend in the study of history of the Ottoman Empire in the recent decades. So, as we all know, from the late 70s, a major boost has occurred in the study of social history in the Ottoman Empire thanks to the discovery of Sharia sigillary, the Muslim court records. The esteem accorded by scholars towards these precious records and their value for studying both social aspects of the province's history or its legal developments has led to the composition of series of monographs dealing with the Ottoman provinces and their urban history. And of course, some of these monographs, the writers of these monographs are sitting here in this room. I would mention only a few. For example, Amnon Cohen's study of Jerusalem, Abraham Marcus' study of Aleppo, Nelly's Hannah's work on Cairo, and of course later works such as Bruce Master's study of Aleppo, Bashar Dumani's studies of Palestine. Of course, I'm missing some, but excuse me for that. I don't have much time. Though these legal documents are regarded until today by some historians as the major resource for writing the social history of the provinces and the center, later historians have discovered that early sigil-based scholarship contains a number of problems and suggests to develop a more careful and critical ways of using legal documents which take into consideration their limitation and weaknesses. First, we should bear in mind that these legal documents, and I'm talking about also sigil-based documents, but also the Jewish legal documents, were not intended by their writers to be used by historians. Legal records are first and foremost meant for legal matters and to be used as reference and a record of notarized legal settlements. Their style is very brief, laconic, which sometimes actually presents a great challenge for historians who are often forced to use their imagination and creativity in their struggle to make historical societies come to life. Second, the second problem or obstacle, the statistical representation of these records is questionable, with some groups among the general population being more represented than others, such are, for example, women and poor, that they are underrepresented. In inheritance cases, for example, we should know that only relatively small percentage of all cases were recorded. Registration was made only when there was a particular problem and when the legal status of the property was unclear. Such records, therefore, cannot be treated as a simple reflection of the past, and the numerical data should not be treated as pure truth. Instead, a full understanding of these legal documents remains to be achieved. What was the procedure of the legal restoration and litigation? What was its aim and practice? Such an awareness that will help to avoid a positivist analysis of these sources with no contextualization. For example, rather than employing just a statistical method which considers a number as a pure representation of the past, it will be better to use the information also as a basis for qualitative analysis in which the data is useful in providing comparative standards and criterion. For example, the sizes of the house, what kind of houses, but not used exclusively. So, to sum up this point, what I mean by this is that we should add more information coming from different sources, such as the Sigil or the Mohalafat, to that data in the above-mentioned article. The conclusion is therefore that this source, the rabbinic court records, though it is an important source and a very interesting record, cannot stand alone in our attempt to draw the urban history of the Jews in Istanbul. If we want to put the Jews into the desired context, the Jewish legal source should share its exclusive place with other Ottoman sources, such as the Istanbul Sigils, that lately actually 17th century Istanbul Sigil is online, the Istanbul Qassam, and Ottoman sources such as the Muhime or else. I would like to move on to Yaron Ben Naez's article. Yaron Ben Naez's article deals with a fascinating issue in Jewish history, but also an issue that has not been sufficiently researched in Ottoman history. The phenomenon of the integration of Jews within the ruling elite of the empire, in contrast to their legal status and in contrast to the prohibitions imposed on Jews and non-Muslims. Ben Naez even claims that the phenomenon in the empire should be accepted and compared to the equivalent phenomenon in Europe, where in both cases the court Jews are suppliers of the army and the Ottoman court. So the relevant context here are that are important to examine in this case are, of course, the phenomenon in Europe, but also, of course, the Ottoman elite between the 17th and the 18th century, 17th and 19th century. So I will try to relate this to the Ottoman phenomenon of the elites in that period, and thus try to contribute to understanding the Jewish phenomenon of the Ottoman elite. As Ben Naez pointed out, the paper is a kind of a preliminary introduction rather than a well-established research, and therefore I have chosen three main questions that arises from the paper, and I would like to suggest some answers and some directions. I'll start first with the question arises in the article. Ben Naez points to a change in the Jewish elite of the 15th century and 16th century, and the elites of the 17th, 18th, 19th century. If in the early centuries they were physicians, then in the later century they were merchant, purveyors, and at times financiers. What is the reason for the change, and what are the factors in the empire and among the Jews who actually brought the change in the social composition of the court Jews? There is no doubt that the broader Ottoman context in that case is immeasurably important for understanding the phenomenon. In the 17th and 18th century, far-reaching changes are taking place among the Ottoman elites, and the human resources of the elite is changing beyond recognition. For some 3 decades, the Ottoman scholars actually have been discussing how to describe that change and what is the cause of this change. But in general, I think we can define it as an economic political change. Ariel Salzman described this change in the 18th century as the rise of a new Ottoman economy, where one can find a policy of Ottoman privatization and the possibility of the Ottomans to raise money for their political and military activities by recruiting investors. According to Salzman's revolutionary conclusion, the administrative decentralization that characterized the 18th century did not signify a loss of central authority. On the contrary, this decentralization, and actually it was exemplified by the Malikaneh Muqatta, a tax farm contract, actually a lifetime tax farm contract, was one of the central government's sophisticated strategies undertaken in order to increase its income and authority. With the introduction of the new financial structure, saraf occupied a central place in the tax farming system. Capital kept with the sarafs, who served as a financial agents, moneylender, and bankers, and was essential for all transactions made between the center and the provinces. They supported the Malikaneh holders by providing credit and making payments to the central treasury. They financed the subcontractors, the multazem, by paying the Malikaneh holders the annual installment in advance, and they provided money, jaizeh, to the treasury on behalf of an office holder to secure an office or to be assigned one, especially one that could become a source of wealth. In short, in addition to their traditional roles as moneylenders and money changers, sarafs actually served as intermediaries and provided crucial bridging loans to the Ottoman elite. Another change in the provincial elite is actually the introduction of new positions such as the voivodas. The voivoda was a rising power in the Ottoman administration at that time, yet the voivoda's position afforded him the advantage of relatively safe sanctuary to increase his fortune and political power, while others were generally in danger of losing their career, their property, or even their lives. This could not have happened without the help of mediators in Istanbul, either the Sarraf, who played a fundamental role once the tax farm and the life-term tax fund were introduced, or from other family and household members holding central position in the center of the empire. So shareholders were in some cases, such as the voivodas or the Sarrafs, were in some cases remote investors, as Salzman has already shown, and not necessarily presented on location. They needed a person to handle their matters, interests, and profits in their absence. Now, since the power shifted from the center to the provinces and to the political and economic and the financial elites, the composition of the court Jew also changed, and it became economic in essence, as Sarraf, financiers, and so on, and not social as it used to be. The second question that arises from the paper, actually Benaeh raises as this question, is that the question of risk and the motivation behind the actions, or actually what was the courtier's motivation to serve in such a dangerous position. As Benaeh suggests, it is difficult to find emotional aspects in the historical documents. However, I would like to suggest a thread to that question to deal with the issue of risk, or actually more correctly, I would say, to the issue of risk management. Apparently, the level of risk in various positions was not identical. As we know from the work of Djorzevi and Ilkim Bouquet, viziers and pasha were constantly moved from one place to another all over the empire, sometimes with their entire household, and were constantly subjected to the threat of losing their positions or even their lives. We should keep in mind, of course, that these people also enjoyed better access to desirable position in the center, and as a result, enjoyed more economic and social power, so that the high level of risk was in direct proportion to the level of wealth and power. In my own research, however, I found that just as the level of wealth and the power was not identical between all administrative functions, so was the level of risk not the same. What helped this understanding and conclusion was an in-depth study of the material culture of the Ottoman elite ascended from their assets, actually from inventories. The objects, the houses, the horses, the clothes they left behind allude to a symbolic cultural world on the one hand, and on the other, a different economic value. So we can see that there are different items, same items, but different values. Accordingly, the question of whether to be a local established functionary, such as the voivoda, rather than, for example, a high-flying valley, was perhaps not necessarily a result of failing to climb higher in the political hierarchy, but rather may have been a matter of personal preferences for more stable and settled life of a relatively minor grandee without the danger of losing one's money or, worse, one's head. Thus, the career path of the voivoda, for example, afforded more control over how to spend one's life, and also gave more control over what he could leave after he died. Another factor at the risk management or risk level was the geographical distance. Thus, of course, functionaries who served in a remote locations were at a lower risk level than pashas who were positioned in the center. Now, the third question is that arises in the article is, what was the motivation of the court Jews to be involved in the economic activity of charity with their community? Of course, Benaeh suggests some of the answers, and I would like to add some more. In the Ottoman world, the idea of gift giving, and I'm here expanding the idea of charity to gift giving as well, The idea of gift-giving as a euphemism for patronage was also applicable. In return, this act of protecting and feeding others carried the potential for expanding their political power and reaffirming their legitimacy to rule and to command. The Sultan established a paternalist conception of this power and rule in his act of giving. The most known example, of course, is the practice of imperial gifts, the weekly distribution of alms to poor and to the needy at the Friday prayer, while the recipients were expected to actively display their loyalty to him. So gifts, loans, and debts were all used to create a feeling of indebtedness in a strong ground for patronage relations. How individuals created and perpetuated interactions of patronage in the daily life is, of course, a fascinating question that will help to elaborate on the pragmatic nature of these relations. However, the fact that social and patronage relations were spread all over the Ottoman Empire also makes it difficult to trace and to recapture. Another point is that I've taken from Marcel Mauss's pioneering work that he shows that the motive for giving is actually the expectation of return, and one gives in return because of the fear that his partner will stop giving. Therefore, gifts should be viewed not as one-sided, spontaneous outburst of generosity, but rather as a part of reciprocal system of an exchange of good, in which the act of giving was regulated, obligatory, and self-serving, while creating a personal bond between the parties. As soon as this bond was created, people were compelled to give presents, to receive them, and to reciprocate the initial gift. The idea of reciprocity framed gift relation as keeping while giving. The loss of possession was only temporary. Now, Sharon Catering, in her work, which deals with 16th and 17th century France, actually finds that gift-giving was a euphemism for, as we said before, as a euphemism for patronage. Patrons gave material benefits and thus discussed their power to give and to revoke as a freely given gifts. Clients, in return, gave loyal services discussed as voluntary assistance. The reciprocity was obligatory, and the benefits and the services had to be rendered more than once in the long run. So,
excuse me, just please concentrate.
Okay, so I'll
5 minutes more, but no
5 minutes more. Okay,
no more.
so I'm. So in short, okay. So what was left is actually Aviv Deri's article, and I have only one point, so it will be, I think, sufficient. The article, Aviv Deri's article discusses the ways in which the Ottoman citizenship and foreign protection were actually adopted by non-Muslims elite in the province of Damascus. Deri is re-examining and challenging the old conception of the Ottoman citizenship and the citizenship law as adopted at the end of the 19th century. Deri actually turns the spotlight on the economic aspects and the motivation of the national and the citizenship law, and argues that the question of nationality as adopted by the Ottoman state was a question of protection and not nationality in its current sense. So Deri claims that the state is still practicing patterns of protection, patronage, and household practices that are known from the old Ottoman politics right into the 20th century. At the same time, the state ignores the practice of protecting the non-Muslim subject because they actually endangered the economic arrangement and not because they actually wanted to make themselves modern. So at that point, I would like to discuss, actually to bring into our discussion one point, and that is the point of the patronage and the politics of household. Deri seeks to link her historical findings to the politics of patronage and to the politics of households that according to her claims, still exist in the 19th century despite the Tanzimat and despite the legal changes. But at the same time, it shows that the practices of patronage and protection were not necessarily given to all household members, but sometimes to individuals. At this point, it is important to ask ourselves the question whether the protection for individual is still within the concept of the politics of household. In other words, whether protection is an equal word for patronage. I suggest that we shouldn't take that as an equal as a same terminology. This is not. Protection is not compatible with the patronage politics and households, and in other words, protection is only one aspect of patronage, and therefore it is not an indication of the continuous existence of the old politics. Perhaps we can say that that we can see this period as a transitional period, but not as a complete continuity with the politics of households and patronage. Now, another point, and this is the last one, will be that in this article, actually, Derry attributes only economic motives to the state's actions concerning practices of protection and patronage, and it will be interesting at that point to examine other aspects, not only financial, not only economical, but also cultural aspects of these elites, and actually to bring into our awareness these cultural aspects and to examine by these aspects whether these practices of patronage still exist as they used to exist in the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century. These local bureaucrats and these local notable families actually sought to become part of this Ottoman government, and therefore they created this kinship and political patronage relations with the central administration and acquired askeri status, but that was in the 18th century. Since they were very much influenced by the Ottoman social and political elite culture, this Ottomanization process usually also involved a cultural component as well, and this is what I suggest is whether if we want to claim that these politics of households and patronage still exist in the late 19th century and beginning of 20th century, we have to search for these cultural components of their practices. Thank you very much.